Every African American carries a half of themselves that almost nobody talks about. When the story of where Black America came from gets told, it points to West Africa, the Gold Coast, the door of no return, the ports that became museums. But there's a second origin, larger than the first, that the popular map leaves off entirely. Scientists who read it directly out of living DNA found it was the single biggest source of all, and the kingdom at the center of it was nothing like what we were taught to imagine. Let's start with where this comes from, because it isn't a theory or a folk memory. In July 2020, the American Journal of Human Genetics published one of the most comprehensive genetic studies of the transatlantic slave trade ever assembled. The lead author was Stephen Micheletti, a population geneticist at 23, and me, working alongside geneticist Joanna Mountain and a team that included historians. They didn't study a few hundred people. They combined the DNA of more than 50,000 individuals on both sides of the Atlantic, people living today in North America, the Caribbean, Central and South America, and people across the African regions their ancestors were taken from. Then they did something that hadn't been done at this scale before. They laid that genetic data side by side with the historical records of the slave trade itself, the shipping manifests, the disembarkation ports, the numbers compiled in the transatlantic slave trade database built by historians David Eltis and David Richardson. They asked a simple, devastating question. Does the DNA of the descendants match the paper trail of the ships? Where the two agree, history is confirmed. Where they disagree, something happened that the documents alone could never tell you. And one of the clearest findings to come out of all that data was this. When the researchers traced the African roots of African Americans in the United States, the largest share didn't point where most people would guess. It pointed towards Central Africa, toward the region of present-day Angola and the Democratic Republic of Kongo. That's not the West Africa of the textbooks, that's somewhere else entirely. And to understand why that's so surprising, you have to understand the map most of us have been carrying in our heads. Ask most people where enslaved Africans came from, and the answer comes back in a familiar shape. Ghana, the slave castles at Cape Coast, and Elmina, where tourists now walk through the dungeons. Senegal, and the famous door of no return on Gorée Island. Nigeria, the Yoruba, the Igbo, the whole imagined geography of Black American origin sits up there along the western bulge of the continent, the part that faces out toward the Atlantic and sits closest on the map to the Americas. That picture isn't wrong, it's just incomplete in a way that erases an enormous amount of the truth. Because below that western bulge, where the coastline turns and runs south past the mouth of the Congo River and down toward Angola, lies a region the historical records call West Central Africa. And through most of the nearly 4 centuries the trade operated, this was not a minor supplier. It was the single largest region of departure for enslaved Africans in the entire history of the transatlantic trade. The numbers are staggering even by the standards of an atrocity measured in millions. Of the roughly 12.5 million Africans forced onto slave ships between the early 1500s and the 1860s, around 5.7 million embarked from the ports of West Central Africa. No other region comes close. More captives left from this stretch of coast than from Senegambia, the Gold Coast, and the Bight of Benin combined. For long stretches of the early trade, West Central Africa accounted for the majority of every African carried across the ocean. This was the demographic heart of the entire system, and somehow it became the part of the story we tell the least. So when the DNA of living African Americans points back toward Angola and the Congo Basin, the genetics and the shipping records are, in this case, telling the same story. The largest single route of Black America runs not to the West African coast of the popular imagination, but to Central Africa. The half nobody talks about turns out to have been the biggest half all along. Now here's where it gets more complicated and more interesting, because DNA and ledgers don't always agree, and the places they disagree are where the real history hides. The same study found patterns that the shipping records alone could never explain. Nigerian ancestry, for example, shows up in African Americans far more strongly than the direct voyages to North America would predict. On paper, Relatively few ships sailed straight from the Bight of Biafra to the ports of what became the United States. Yet the genetic signal is loud. The researchers, puzzled, brought the question to historians, and the answer was its own kind of horror. Many people taken from the Nigerian coast were first shipped to the British Caribbean and then sold a second time, moved on intercolonial voyages from the islands into North America. The trade didn't stop at the Atlantic crossing. People were bought and sold and shipped again. And the DNA records that second journey even where no single manifest does. There were other distortions too. People from the Senegambia region show up less in African American DNA than the records of arrival would suggest. The grim, likely explanation is that Senegambians, often skilled rice cultivators, were concentrated on the deadly rice plantation of the Low Country, where mortality was so brutal that fewer of them lived to pass their DNA forward. The genetic record isn't just a map of where people came from. It's a map of who survived, who was allowed to have children, and under what conditions. And the most disturbing distortion of all is written into the difference between men and women. The historical records are clear that the majority of people forced onto the ships were male, but when the researchers looked at how much each sex actually contributed to the gene pool of their descendants, the picture inverted. Across Central and South America and the Latin Caribbean, the study estimated that for every African man who passed his ancestry forward, roughly 15 African women did. The same female bias, though less extreme, holds across North America too. Joanna Mountain put it plainly that the bias is shocking precisely because most of the enslaved were men. There's only one explanation for a gene pool that flips the sex ratio that hard, and it is the systematic, generation-long sexual exploitation of enslaved women. The DNA didn't just record where people came from or who survived, it recorded what was done to them. The science is not abstract here. Every percentage point is a person, and the shape of the data is the shape of a crime. To make sense of how a single region can leave such a deep genetic mark, it helps to think about how ancestry actually accumulates. Imagine pouring different colored sands into a single jar over many generations. Early on, whatever you pour in first and pour in most ends up forming the largest layers at the bottom, and everything added later mixes on top of that foundation without ever fully replacing it. The earliest and largest African contributions to a population become the base layer that every later generation is built upon. And because enslaved communities were often cut off, confined, and forced to have children within a limited pool, that founding signature didn't get diluted the way it might in a freely mixing population. It got concentrated. A relatively small number of founding ancestors can echo down through hundreds of thousands of descendants, their genetic signature growing louder rather than fainter with each generation. Geneticists have a name for the way a founding group's genetic signature gets locked in and amplified across the generations that follow. They call it the founder effect. West Central Africa wasn't just a large supplier, it was an early and foundational one. And that foundational layer still shows up centuries later in the blood of millions, not as a faint trace, but as a dominant chord. When geneticists describe a person whose DNA combines ancestry from multiple, distinct populations, they call the result a mixture. Almost every African American is, in genetic terms, admixed, carrying African ancestry alongside European and often indigenous American ancestry. Studies led by geneticist Katarzyna Brink, also published in the American Journal of Human Genetics, found that self-identified African Americans carry, on average, around 73% African ancestry. And within that African portion, the two heaviest contributors are the Nigerian region and West Central Africa, the Kongo and Angola heartland. That second source, the one that rarely makes it into the story, is sitting right there in the data, accounting for a massive share of the African American genome. But the number is only the beginning of what makes this hidden half so remarkable. Because the thing we were taught to picture when we heard the word Africa in this context, the thing the trade and the centuries since worked hard to make us picture, was simple, tribal, without history or writing or states. And the Kingdom of Congo blows that picture apart completely. If you connect with the people whose research keeps recovering stories like this one, hit subscribe, because the channel exists to put the real history back where it belongs, with the people it belongs to. Now let me show you exactly who the Kongo were. The Kingdom of Congo emerged in the 14th century, well before any European ship reached its shores. At its height, it ruled territories spanning parts of what is now Angola, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the Republic of Congo, a centralized state with a capital city, a royal court, provincial governors, a tax system, and a standing military. This was not a village. This was a kingdom comparable in scale and organization to the European monarchies that would soon come knocking. In 1483, Portuguese ships arrived, and the Congo did not meet them as primitives meeting a superior power. The Manicongo, the king, received the Portuguese with the formal protocol of a ruler used to managing relationships between states. Within a few years, the Congolese king Nzinga Ainkuwu converted to Catholicism. His son, who took the name Alfonso I and ruled from 1506, went further than anyone could have predicted. He built a Christian kingdom in Central Africa, not a colony, not a mission, a sovereign Christian state run by Africans. Alfonso established schools. By 1516, there were over 1,000 students in the royal school at the capital. He created a literate noble class, and his school system grew under his successors until there were dozens of schools in the capital, in Banza, Congo, and others in provincial cities. Congolese scribes copied and composed texts in their own hand. The kingdom maintained a class of diplomats who were active across Europe and South America for generations. An embassy reached Lisbon as early as 1487, and others followed throughout the 1500s, including missions sent all the way to Rome. He sent his own son, Henrique, to Europe to be educated, and in 1518, Henrique was made a bishop by the Vatican, likely the first sub-Saharan African Catholic bishop in history. Congolese diplomats walked the corridors of European power while Europe was still in the Renaissance. Letters written by Congo's kings to the kings of Portugal, to the Pope himself, survive today in the Portuguese National Archive and in the Vatican's own collections, one of them addressed to Pope Paul V and dated to 1617. These are among the most important written records of pre-colonial Africa, and they were written by Africans, in their own hand, about their own kingdom. While Europe imagined Africa as a blank and silent place, the Congo was writing its own history down. And that history still exists in archives, waiting to be read. And here's the part that should stop you cold. As the Portuguese demand for human beings grew, and as Portuguese traders began seizing his own free subjects, Afonso fought back with the tools of a statesman. In 1526, he wrote directly to the King of Portugal, protesting that traders were kidnapping his people, and these are his documented words from that correspondence, that they were seizing nobles, vassals, even members of his own family, until the land itself was being emptied of its people. He wrote that his kingdom needed no European merchandise except wine and flour for the mass. He said it was his wish that his kingdom not be a place for the trade or transport of slaves. A Central African king, writing in the 1520s, naming the slave trade as the destruction of his nation and demanding it stop. The Portuguese crown received his letters. They acknowledged them politely. They called him their beloved brother in Christ, and they did nothing because the trade was too profitable to give up. The man we were never taught existed saw exactly what was coming, said so in writing, and was ignored by a European power that had already decided African lives were a commodity. Now honesty matters here, and the channel's whole reason for being is to give you the real version, not the flattering one or the simple one. So let me be precise about what this DNA and this history do and don't say. First, the Congo was not only a victim of the trade. Like several African states pulled into the Atlantic system, its rulers and nobles also participated in it, supplying captives, profiting from the exchange, and using the trade in their own internal wars. The kingdom kept enslaved people of its own, including the soldier slaves who would matter enormously later in this story. The trade drew Kongo in and ultimately helped tear it apart through generations of civil war. But participation and victimhood existed side by side. None of this shifts the weight of responsibility off the European powers who created the transatlantic demand, financed the ships, and built economies on stolen people, or off the American slaveholders who profited for centuries. The Portuguese, and later the British and the Americans, drove this system and reaped its rewards. That is the moral center of the story, and it does not move. Second, a word of genuine scientific caution about the DNA itself. When a test or a study says West Central African, it is naming a broad region, not a single people. That region was home to many distinct ethnic and language groups. The Kongo were one, but far from the only one. The historical category, Angola, as the traders used it, lumped together peoples who would never have called themselves the same thing. The Voyager's database itself, for all its power, was built from incomplete record. Historians like Paul Lovejoy have pointed out that its regional categories blur real distinctions that mattered on the ground. So when we say the largest route of Black America runs to the Kongo and Angola coast, we mean a region and an era, not a tidy single tribe. The precision has limits and the honest version says so. What survives all those caveats, though, is the core finding. The Central African contribution to African American ancestry is real. It is large, and for generations it has been told as if it were small. So let's bring it home, because this isn't really a story about a database. It's a story about what's been carried silently in millions of people who were told their history started on a slave ship. If West Central Africa is the hidden half of the DNA, then its fingerprints should be all over Black American culture. And once you know to look, they are everywhere. Consider the ring shout, the sacred counterclockwise circle dance that took root in the Black churches and praise houses of the American South and the Gula Geechee communities of the Sea Islands. That counterclockwise circle is not a random form. It echoes a Central African religious symbol called the Kongo cosmogram, the Dikenga, a cross within a circle representing the journey of the soul through the world of the living and the world of the dead, the sun's daily passage, the unbroken cycle between this life and the ancestors. In Bakongo belief, the living and the dead are separated by a watery line, and the soul moves around the circle the way the sun moves across the sky, which is exactly why the dancers move the way they do. Enslaved Bakongo people carried that cosmology across the ocean in the only luggage that couldn't be confiscated, their minds. Archaeologists have found the cosmogram etched into pottery and drawn on the floors of church basements in the United States. Scholars trace pieces of it into hoodoo, into the water symbolism of spirituals like wade in the water, into the very language of the Gullah, which preserves words that traveled from Kikongo. The shape of how Black Americans worshiped carried a Central African map of the universe inside it, hidden in plain sight, disguised as a dance, so that it could survive in a country that tried to erase everything else. And then there is the most direct evidence of all, written in fire into American history. In September 1739, near the Stono River in South Carolina, the largest slave rebellion of the colonial era broke out. The enslaved people who led it spoke Portuguese. They were Catholic. They moved by some accounts with the discipline of trained soldiers. Historians have concluded that the Stono rebels were almost certainly from the Kingdom of Kongo, likely former soldiers from its civil wars, sold into slavery and shipped to Carolina, who understood firearms and military tactics, who shared a language and a faith because they came from that literate Christian diplomatic kingdom we were told never existed. They marched towards Spanish Florida and the promise of freedom, banners raised calling out for liberty. They were defeated, and in the aftermath, terrified South Carolina lawmakers passed the Negro Act of 1740, which among other things banned teaching enslaved people to read. A law passed in part because the rebels had been too organized, too capable, too clearly the product of a society with its own knowledge and its own arms. Think about what that means. The literacy of the Kongo, the thing that made Afonso's letters possible 2 centuries earlier, was so threatening when it crossed the ocean that an American colony outlawed reading to suppress it. The hidden half wasn't just hidden by accident, it was actively buried because the people who came from it knew how to fight, knew how to organize, and knew in their bones that they had come from somewhere that mattered. That is the recovery this finding offers. Not a flattering myth, but a true one. If you carry West Central African ancestry, and statistically, if you are African American, a large share of you almost certainly does, then part of your origin is a kingdom that wrote to the Pope, that schooled its nobles, that sent ambassadors to Rome, and whose king named the slave trade as a crime and demanded it end while Europe pretended not to hear. The story did not start in chains. The chains were an interruption of a story that was already old, already written down, already proud. The people who survived the Middle Passage and built families on this side of the ocean were not blank arrivals. They were the descendants of a civilization, carrying its sense of the sacred in the way they danced, its memory in the way they prayed, and its refusal to be owned in the way they rose up. The trade tried to convert a people into a quantity, a number on a manifest, a price at auction. What the DNA gives back is the proof that the number was always a person, and the person came from somewhere with a name, a history, and a king who saw the catastrophe coming and put it in writing. The map most of us inherited put Black America's origins in one place and left out the largest part of the truth. The DNA puts the missing half back, and the kingdom at the center of it was never who we were told it was.